So thank you very much. Okay, getting back to it, we're going to go now to the climate reality presentation, and we're going to talk about the realities right now. So welcome to the show, 3 chapters. Here we go. So, ladies and gentlemen, as I mentioned, I worked for Al Gore for the last couple of years, and there's some basic realities that need to be presented about what's going on with the climate, but we also want to put ourselves in perspective. We are on planet Earth. We are the lucky Goldilocks planet. We have a beautiful atmosphere. We have tons of water. We have weather conditions and climate conditions conducive to growth. We've been extraordinarily lucky. And we could be on Mars. It could be dry and dusty and the future home of billionaires, but it might not work. And it could be Venus. Look how hot Venus is. Maybe 900, 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit at least. It sounds overwhelming. But Earth, the Goldilocks planet, the beautiful blue marble in space. The population of the Earth, the Homo sapiens population anyway, has been extraordinarily lucky. We reached 1 billion people by around 1800. We'd doubled that by the mid-1920s. And by the time I was born in 1952, the 1950 population estimate was 2.3 billion. So right now it's at 7.9 billion. Which means in my lifetime, 69 years, the population of the planet has more than tripled, the human population, the devastating human population. So it ends up being a time of extraordinary growth, and we've been very lucky and we've been spreading out. So we've been a very successful species, but not necessarily a very beneficial one. Let's take a look at some basics of climatology here. We know that solar radiation in the form of light waves passes through our atmosphere. Most of this radiation is absorbed by the Earth and warms it. Some energy is radiated back into space by the Earth in the form of infrared waves. Some of this outgoing infrared radiation is trapped by the Earth's atmosphere and warms it. As the CO2 concentration increases, more and more of the heat of the atmosphere starts to increase. The temperature of the atmosphere starts to increase. And we do know that we have a thin atmosphere. We know that the atmosphere is at most about 300 miles deep, but the reality is the sort of usable atmosphere is about 10 miles deep. You figure when you fly in a jet plane, you're up at about 35,000 feet. That's about 7 miles up. And the oxygen decreases with time, as does air pressure and so on. It becomes an unlivable situation. And so it's a very thin atmosphere. Think of it as like Earth is a ball bearing and the atmosphere around it is like a thin mist. It's actually that level of the ratio is at about that level. So we also know that climate change has been something that's been going on since the beginning of Earth. We can see back what they were able to measure about 600 million years ago. We can see that atmospheric CO2 goes up and down over time. So do average global temperatures, not necessarily completely related, but you can see that you can see a correlation there to an extent. But it's changed all kinds of times without human interference, without human interjections. If you look at the right, graphic, you notice that in the last 12,000 years, there's been a lot of ups and downs. They can say that during Roman times, there was, for example, a well-warmed period. And during the early Middle Ages, they were growing grapes in Britain in the 10th and 11th century. So we know there was a warm medieval period. So in other words, we weren't influencing the climate that much. But what's going on now is that we're spewing 162 million tons of man-made global warming pollution into the thin shell of our atmosphere every 24 hours. We're treating our own atmosphere like an open sewer. Here's some ways we do that. The biggest sources of greenhouse gases. Take a look at this little animation: oil production, coal plants, coal mining, industrial process, industrial agriculture, transportation, both land and air, and of course, thawing permafrost. There's a lot of contributors to it. A lot of them are anthropogenic and man-made. We know that we've been heavily polluting the atmosphere since the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution in Britain at the end of the 18th century. As industrialization spread, so did pollution. And over time, that's been a major contributor to fossil fuel emissions. By the beginning of the 20th century, of course, the automobile was. The original Model T shown here got about 21.5 miles per gallon when it came out in 1908. I got a Toyota 4-cylinder pickup, a Toyota Tacoma pickup in 2003, and it got 25 miles per gallon. Not much of an improvement over in a century. So, but at the same time, there was always some tinkering. There's been a lot of fascination with car making. And it's an odd thing, though, when you think about it, a 3,000 pound combination of steel and plastic and copper and all rubber, all kinds of stuff goes together to carry a 210 pound man around for about an hour a day. There's something kind of wacky about that. When this picture was taken, there was about 800,000 cars a year being produced. Now, last year, there was 78 million. Let's take a look at the largest source of global warming pollution. It's the burning of fossil fuels. And we can see this famous hockey stick graph. By the middle of the 19th century, of course, industrial pollution and spewing of fossil fuels was going on, but it increased again hugely after World War II, the late 40s, early 50s. And then, of course, it climbs up when China industrializes and so forth. It's an ongoing process, our spewing of fossil fuels. Also, methane has gone up over time. And of course, there's a lot of methane in the atmosphere. Methane is seen as about 80 times as strong as a climate change gas as CO2, but there's less of it, fortunately, and it doesn't last as long as CO2. And so, but it's gone way up. And with the uncovering of permafrost in Siberia and Canada, it's bound to go up more. Here's some realities. 19 of the 20 hottest years on record have occurred since the year 2002. You, in the last generation, have experienced the hottest time since we've been measuring temps. That's going on like maybe 175 years or so. And the hottest of all have been the last 7 years. You have lived in the hottest time that we know of. Let's take a look at a basic bell curve and use as a baseline. We'll use the 1950s when I started out. Why not have it be about me? Just kidding. So we start out in the 1950s and we'll go to the 1980s. We'll use this as a baseline. On the left, cooler than average temps. On the right, warmer than average temps. And in the middle, average temps. A certain number, a bell curve, 1951 to 80. So there we go, baseline. By the late 80s to the late 90s, suddenly we see a shift to the right where there's many more warmer than average temps. And there's suddenly an extremely hot part on the extreme right. The next decade, the 1998 to 2008, the warmer than average temps vastly outnumbered the other groupings. Extremely hot temps have grown. And then let's take a look at basically the last decade from 2009 to 2019. Notice the extremely hot zone is huge. And the extreme temperature events that used to cover 0.1% of the land now cover 22.1%. That's basically the end of the last decade. So anecdotal stuff, but let's add it up. This past summer, June to August 2021, was Europe's hottest summer on record. It was also Asia's hottest summer on record, the Eurasian landmass. And something we do know on a basic level is that 93% of the extra heat trapped by man-made global warming pollution goes right into the ocean. So the oceans are heating up at an incredibly hot rate. What this means is that hurricanes are stronger. Hurricane Ida that went up at Louisiana and went basically all the way up the East Coast and out New England, that took place in the Gulf where the waters were up to 4 degrees Celsius higher than normal, 7 degrees Fahrenheit higher than normal. And that heat builds up more moisture and that extends the hurricane. It was a devastating hurricane. We also know about atmospheric rivers and the erraticness of certain weather patterns. Recently in California, we had an atmospheric river. This particular one is perhaps from another event, but in October, the 3rd week of October, in 4 days in Albion, I measured 8.4 inches of rain. And that was an atmospheric river. That was a lot of rain for a 4-day period. So that's typical of an erratic climate pattern. We also know that the same extra heat that evaporates more water than the ocean which causes bigger downpours and floods, also pulls moisture more quickly from the soil and causes longer and deeper droughts. We also know that the last years have been a rather huge drought in the United States. 93% of the US West is experiencing moderate to exceptional drought. Nearly half of California has been in exceptional drought conditions. We had a decent amount of rain until about 2 weeks ago. I haven't gotten any rain in the last 2 weeks. An erratic weather pattern and a break in what's typical is typical of climate change. We also know, and this is real basic, that hotter years typically have more fires. You can see the slope of the graph. You can see that in 1980, there was less fires than there are presently. And you can see that there's, less high temps than there is presently. And that you can also see that there are way more fires than there used to be. We also know this by the amount of work that people have to do. The fire season in the US West is now 105 days longer than it was in 1970. I'm sure you know people who work for Caltrans. I also know there's lots of smoke jumpers and the like. This has had a huge effect. And of course, it's also something that's very discouraging. This was from September of 2020, so a year and a quarter ago. And this is San Francisco at midday. This was with the orange cloud of smoke. We also know that the Amazon is being deforested at a heavy rate, especially in the last years of Bolsonaro. Since he took power in about 2017, it's gone way up. It's gone straight up. And that's a purposeful policy. It is the possibility that the Amazon basin, so-called lungs of the planet because of its huge forest, may be in danger of being denuded and having it end up being a savanna. So that's a difficult prospect to think about, but that is also a political decision by a government. We'll take a look here at Arctic sea ice extent for the last 1,500 years. Notice it starts in 500. Notice the extreme drop-off. This has been in the last quarter century, really, that it's dropped off like this. I make my own Christmas cards. This is one I made in 2005. I'm trying to be a smart aleck and making a joke, but this is what it's seen as, this is a situation it's actually developed. And I'm kind of like, I don't want it to be true. I'm kind of wishing. I mean, the jolly gift giver landing in the drink, come on. So we also know that the north part of our continents, the Northern Hemisphere's peatlands up in Siberia, Northern Canada, etc., they store more carbon than all the world's rainforests combined. So these are situations that can develop now. There have been fires in the peatlands that get snowed over and then restart in the spring. So they're called zombie fires. Now take a look at this. This is a methane bubble in Siberia, and that's a Russian soldier, and that's gas in there. And his boot will pierce it, and you'll hear the gas escape if you can. That's the gas escaping right there. That's methane. That's pure methane. So this is going on all over Russia. There's about 7,000 of these holes. and they occasionally explode. I am not kidding. This is a methane bubble that exploded, and that's the crater. There's human beings on the top there. If you look just you get perspective, if it looks on the straight above the middle. And permafrost is warming at a faster rate. This is oddly, the poles are warming at a faster rate than the center of the planet. There's also an increase in airstrikes, lightning strikes. And this has become something in the Arctic. This has become a big deal. They don't usually see this. The Arctic is seen like last year saw 10 times the amount of lightning that there was in the previous 10 years. People are uncertain about what this means, but it's kind of like pay attention kind of stuff. We also know that tropical diseases, which basically in the tropics to begin with, are spreading with more frequency and are stronger. We know about Zika virus, West Nile virus, a dengue fever, some of these things you associate with travel, but at the same time, it's the extra heat on the planet is giving way to more conducive conditions. They also know that it works well for mosquitoes. They are carriers of Zika. Their range expands more as more locations develop mosquito-friendly. There are more days when a mosquito is active, mosquito's reproduction rate increases, mosquito metabolism accelerates, the virus incubates, blah, blah, blah. Basically, if you like a warming planet, you're a friend of the mosquito, just saying. I don't want to be purposely against mosquitoes, but this is tough to look at. So we also know that a lot of these tropical diseases are zoonotic, meaning they're transmitted from animals to humans. I'm not trying to be against animals, I'm just pointing that out. Of course, nobody really knows where COVID-19, but it's possible, who knows? Now, there's also a thing about climate change that's real daunting, and that is for each degree of centigrade of warming, the grain production goes down. Maize to the tune of 7.4%, wheat 6%, and so on. And be mindful that grains, these four crops make up 2/3 of human caloric intake. So if your population goes up and your food's, just saying, paying attention. So we also know that climate can be causative of making for warlike situations. From 2006 to 2010, Syria had a serious drought. As this farmer says, he had 400 acres of wheat and now it's all desert. Now, this is going on, and in 2000, those 4 years, drought turned 60% of Syria's fertile land into desert and drove 1.5 million people into Syria's already crowded cities. The spring of 2011 is the Arab Spring. Syria breaks out in rioting, etc. There's civil war, and there has been civil war in Syria ever since. Climate causative, or at least part causation, it's the environmental conditions that are pushing people into situations that force them together in warlike places and also make them emigrate. Now, at this point, as things heat up, this is what they call uninhabitable zones. It's too damn hot. So that's basically unlivable. At this point, parts of the Sahara are. But under threat in the next 50 years are whole sections of India and as well as the Amazon basin, most of Brazil. That is a very daunting prospect if whole sections, there's 1.3 billion people in India. This is also something that brings along migration. This is actually a propaganda poster from Brexit back in 2016. And this was used, it's a mass of migrants moving up from a war or drought-stricken area to Europe. And this was used by the right wing in Brexit. But the reality is of course people will move as migrants when there's climate emergencies, just like they do in civil wars. Over time, there have been numerous mass extinctions that have nothing to do with human beings. As we can see, these ones that went on 450, 340 million years ago, and down, of course, to the dinosaur one, they're caused, you see the dinosaur asteroid impact, volcanic activity, asteroid impacts, falling sea levels. There's a variety of things that go on. At this point, though, we are in what they're calling the sixth great extinction. Something like 50% of animal species are threatened by extinction in the next half century. This kind of stuff this causation is human. It's anthropogenic. It's caused by us. That's you can't help but feel a little about this particular reality. Now, what are some climate tipping points? Well, I promise you we'll soon be out of the dreary, bad news situation. We've got some good news coming up, I promise. Now, these are some ones that they talk about as climate tipping points. What is well beyond the pale? What is pushing us in a direction? And one of them is the shutdown of the ocean conveyor belt, the jet stream and all that. And we're going to take a look. They're saying at this point that the jet stream is becoming wavier. There's steeper troughs and higher ridges, and it means that weather systems progress more slowly, raise the chances for long duration extreme events like droughts. This is the jet stream, January 5th, 2021. So a year ago. This is in the lead up to the Texas freeze. In early January 2021, experts warned that unusual polar vortex activity would bring the potential for paralyzing snowstorms and blasts of Arctic air for weeks or even months. The jet stream, this is on February 15th. For the first time ever, the entire state of Texas was under a winter storm warning. And this is the kind of stuff that was being predicted in the movies like The Day After Tomorrow. This is called cli-fi, climate fiction. And, it's kind of scary stuff. And but at the same time, it seemed like we were living through that kind of thing. Interesting. So to round things up here, these are the realities that show us that climate change is happening. And this is 10 indicators: water vapor up, temperature over oceans up, sea surface temperature up, air temperature and troposphere up. And then we have less glaciers and ice sheets, less snow cover, less sea ice, etc. These are realities. And this is the IPCC. This is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And this is their most recent report. And they've been doing this for years. It's unequivocal that human influence that has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. It's reality. And another reality is it's costly. It is costlier to put up with climate change than it would be. It's beyond reason. A lot of times politicians and certainly corporate heads say, well, it costs too much to change things. Well, but the reality is, look at all these costs. The cost of climate change is extraordinary. And it's amazing. It is, in fact, the #1 threat to the global economy. And unmet, undealt with, etc., it makes things worse. And also, let's just remind us on basic principle. This is from Dr. Guy McPherson. If you really think that the environment is less important than the economy, try holding your breath while you count your money. Just saying. So let's look at some realities, though. We have solutions at hand. We have a lot of stuff either already on the ground or in the works. And in a lot of ways, we're moving in the right directions. Let's take a look at the realities about wind capacity. Back in 2000, they predicted that we would reach 30 gigawatts by 2010. But by 2020, that goal was exceeded by a factor of 24 times. Wind is booming out all over. And here's a reality too. Globally, wind could supply worldwide electricity consumption 40 times over. We have enough wind to make everything happen. And here's the reality about the United States. The prairie states from North Dakota down to Texas are like the Saudi Arabia of wind. It's the windiest part of the world. And basically that is tappable. That part of the country from North Dakota down to Texas could run the United States. So wind is powerful. We're getting better at storing it. We'll talk more about that soon. And here's another reality. And this is one that makes you know solar is here to stay. Enough solar energy reaches Earth every hour to fill all the world's energy needs for a full year. Think about that. All we have to do is absorb that solar power, take it in and then put it in batteries, store it, and then use it. And at a certain point, It's all about storage. But the reality is the sun is definitely there to help us, and it meets our energy needs. Let's take a look at solar energy progress. How do projections compare? In 2002, they were predicting it would be 1 gigawatt per year by 2010. In reality, the goal was exceeded by 17 times. And then by 121 times, solar has been booming. And then this is also some talk about a very eminent climate change scientist, Michael Mann from Penn State. And he says the lag between halting CO2 emissions and halting the rise in global temperatures may be as little as 3 to 5 years. Now, in other words, he said, if we get our rear ends in gear and actually try to make an effort toward a greener economy and with more green subsidies, et cetera, we've got a chance to slow things down and start to reverse them. Let's take a look at global wind energy capacity. This is since 1980, if you look at the graph. And notice how it's boomed since 2005. This is wind capacity. Onshore wind costs have also gone down. This is in euros. Meanwhile, we have many more solar photovoltaic installations. Notice once again how it took off by around 2005. And crystalline silicon solar cell modules have gone way down in price. Look at that, 1976, $79.40. Here we are in 2020, we're talking 20 cents per watt. There is anecdotal things that at this point, we need to make sure they become regular things. The share of Germany's electricity from renewables peaked at 100% on 2 different dates in 2018. There's also newer stats. They're working out in a lot of ways that there's a lot of European countries that are reaching this. In Britain, for example, the home of the coal industry and the home of the Industrial Revolution, they generated 18 times as much from electricity from renewables as from coal 2 years ago. It's also true when they talk about jobs. Solar installer is forecast to be the fastest growing job category in the US through 2028, and wind turbine technician is second. In the US, 5 times as many jobs in solar as in coal mining. Over the last 5 years, US solar energy jobs have grown 5 times faster than the overall economy. I know I sound like a salesman, but these are truisms and they need to be known. Investments in renewables and energy efficiency create 3 times more jobs than investments in fossil fuel technologies. And renewable energy now last couple of years made up 80% of all the net electrical capacity added globally. So in other words, we're moving in that direction. Let's take a look at Europe. Solar and wind make up 88% of new electrical capacity in the last couple of years. In the United States, even in 2019, when Donald Trump was president, 70% of new capacity was from solar and wind. In China, of course, still has a large coal sector, but 63% of the new capacity was from solar and wind. And India, also a big economy, although they also have a large coal sector, almost 70% of the capacity was from solar and wind. So there's a movement in that direction. Yet at the same time, there's also subsidies that, in terms of subsidies, both from the government and from different laws, et cetera, renewables only get about $143 billion in subsidies, while the fossil fuel industry still gets around $6 trillion. Some of these are externalities. It might be closer to 2 trillion, but it would still be a factor of like 15 times what the renewables get. Actually, it's 42 times at this point, counting all the externalities. And at the same time, think of things that go into subsidizing fossil fuels. The United States spends $80 billion a year on carrier groups and defending the Middle East that are oil related. That wouldn't be true if we weren't beholden to that lobby or that sort of area. And this is some of the realities that go on with subsidies. Yet when you always ask that question, how did the people who maintain this philosophy about coal being goddess and stuff, how do they solve their energy needs? This is the Kentucky Coal Mining Museum in Benham, Kentucky. Well, in 2017, they had solar panels installed, and the museum estimates they will save $8,000 to $10,000 per year in energy costs. How about that, Kentucky Coal Mining Museum? Now, one of the things is we always want to make sure if in fact coal mining ends up not being a job anymore, the vast majority of US coal miners have to be supported, retrained for new jobs, given opportunities in new fields, especially in the expansion of solar and wind. And there are ways to do this for a couple $2 billion here and there, he says. But at the same time, I think this is not only doable, it's very worthy. And what's going on is the world is moving away from coal and is moving towards alternative energy. Back in 2014, electricity from solar and wind was cheaper than new coal plants in only about 1% of the world. But in the last couple of years, in 5 years or so, solar and wind provided the cheapest sources in 2/3 of the world. And they're saying that in 3 years from now, by the time this is done, with 2024, these would be the cheapest electricity sources in the entire world. And we're talking business groups. Solar plus batteries is set to begin a dramatic transformation in human civilization. We do know that lithium ion batteries have gone down in price a lot. They are more available. At the same time, we also know that's potentially the way of the future. Global electric cars have been on the road, and this has been a big boom. And of course, this will continue to be a big boom, and this will transition over the next generation or so. Now, at this point, too, powertrain cost comparisons, we know that mainstream battery electric cars projected to achieve cost parity with efficient fossil fuel cars by 2023-24. So this is a reality. It's getting alternative technologies are getting better. And notice the Tesla electric semi, this is a giant truck that Tesla's got going, will have a 300 to 500 mile range and use just 2 kilowatt hours of electricity per mile. This is kind of a snazzy truck. It looks a little bit like, maybe Batman drives it, but this is what Tesla's working on. It's kind of interesting. We also know that lithium, if lithium is pulled down the ground, as people who would be good shepherds of the planet, we have an obligation to make sure that these lithium countries, et cetera, and the mines are environmentally as sound as possible. If this is abusive to the land, this would be a stupid way to have an alternative energy future. I think, though, this is doable. We also know that we've got things coming like smart highways. Smart highways, we've got these natural black surfaces that are potentially massive solar collectors. And what they're doing in experiments is using that to light the night highway, to give extra energy, to solarize certain parts. It's been amazing what has come up, what is actually possible in the smart highways of the future. It's really quite impressive. So this is going on. These are the kind of thoughts that are going on in other technologies. And so think, is there any precedent for such a rapid adoption of a new technology? Remember the Moon project. Of course, this was a major effort by the United States and by the Russians too. 1961, President Kennedy said we would put a person on the moon in this decade. In 1969, Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. Now, granted, NASA had been around a few years longer than Kennedy came into office, say mid-50s or so. But the amount of, when they put their mind to it, they could overcome things. For those people who can't stand the space project, I get it, but it's still quite an achievement. There's also been people coming together in different ways in other treaties. The treaties on lead paint in the late 70s, there was acid rain treaties for North America and other places in the early 90s. And of course, there was a treaty on chlorofluorocarbons that was in 1987. This was the Montreal Agreement of September 1987. A few years earlier, people had come to the conclusion that chlorofluorocarbons, which at the time were used in refrigerants around the world, they were being released. And when they went through the atmosphere, they were creating holes in the ozone over both the North and South Pole. And when people became aware of it across the planet, they realized they were endangering the planet. And a couple of years later, they came through with the Montreal Agreement. And this has outlawed it. Now there's been lately a little infringement on this, but that's a whole other story. The whole point is that they outlawed it as a world. They made a difference by coming together. Now think about this as a previous precedent. Back in 1980, AT&T commissioned a study to forecast cell phone use by the year 2000. They projected 900,000 users. The actual figure was 109 million. That was 120 times higher. And now there's 9.5 billion cell phone connections. This has been a leapfrog technology. And speaking of leapfrog technologies, that being a technology that jumps over necessary. You don't need to hang phone lines in the Sudan if you've already got cell phones. You don't need to run power lines if you've already got your own solar collectors. This is in South Sudan. And this is the leapfrog technology of having your own mini solar array and running it to LED lighting. This low initial cost makes small solar systems affordable in developing countries. Your kid has a chance to study by the light of an LED light. It's just transformative in certain ways. It really made a difference. Notice this. This is in Sierra Leone in Africa, solar-powered laptops. These are relatively sort of cheap pedestrian computers, but they're connected to the net. They give people a chance to, use a classroom of computers and run them to little solar panels. This is amazing. This is going on in Sierra Leone. These people are hugely benefited by certain things. There are also comprehensive sort of green technologies out in Drawdown, which is a really impressive book if you've got the energy. It's about 250 pages, and it's full of different plans for the future. I think it's got 100 plans, and they vary from different alternative energy things like microgrids and so on. Like a village like Mendocino could have a microgrid. And they've also got things going on like this. This is green infrastructure, is the notion of building towns that combine rural with urban and make it so they're more integrated yet different. I mean, it's kind of hard to describe. These are like potential components of green infrastructure here. There's buffer zones, there's core areas and so on. The notion is core areas of high biodiversity. And there's whole new notions being talked about and thought about, including a national supergrid. When they have all this recent whining about infrastructure and so on, this is the kind of stuff that's necessary for an alternative energy future, is to take into account that we have in the Southwest a natural, powerful solar collector. And in the central states, we have a natural wind funnel. And I'm not just talking about the wind created by a politician like Ted Cruz. I mean, the guy has enormous power on the wind scale, yet his whole area, that whole prairie state Midwest there, has tons of potential. You combine them all in a national supergrid that's run in a more efficient way. We also benefit more by turning to a more plant-rich diet. This one is a fascinating thing. We do know that cattle together contribute about 15% of greenhouse gases. And if cattle were a nation, they would be the third biggest greenhouse emitter. That's a stunning thing when you think of. Now, I don't want to be against cows. I just want the reality to be known. Our dependence on cows has definitely distorted things. There was an Oxford University study that said by changing to vegetarianism, this area of emitting of CO2 would be cut down, areas associated with our eating would be cut down by 63%. So vegetarianism would help out. I have to admit, I'm not yet a vegetarian. I eat less and less meat, but Not yet. But having said that, I am definitely impressed by the vegetarian contribution to stopping climate change. Also think about things like the many uses for hemp. Okay, people make jokes. Oh, that old pothead, what does he know? Well, the reality is that if we can use hemp for things that we presently use cotton for. If we change from cotton to hemp, cotton uses 16% of all pesticides. Hemp could replace cotton for jeans, jackets, canvas shoes. This would have a significant impact on carbon emissions, and we'd be eliminating a lot of pesticides. Hemp's kind of a champion. George Washington raised hemp, just saying. We've also got to get better about recycling. We had a recent dip here in California when a couple of years ago, when the Chinese kind of pulled out of the international recycling scheme. And suddenly we didn't know which garbage can to put this in and why this had to go there and all that kind of stuff. But the reality is we have to get better at it. When you think in South Korea, they actually save 90% of all their paper they use. In Europe, around 75%. They also have in a lot of European countries in the EU, they have what they call extended producer responsibility. And this makes companies responsible not just for creating their goods, but also for managing them post-use. If this became a reality, think about it, waste would be cut way back. Think about all the different boxes you get with an Amazon thing. Those guys know how to waste cardboard. We don't have to be that way. So now the question becomes, now we head towards chapter 3 of our little climate update. The question becomes, will we change? We know we can, we know we're capable of it. Recently, they had the COP26. This is the Conference of the Parties, created under a UN framework convention. The first one was the famed Rio Summit back in 1992. And the most famous one, of course, was the Paris Agreement of 2015. We see this New York Times graphic here on the lower right, which shows global greenhouse gas emission pathways. This is where the top one is where we were headed pre-Paris Agreement. The middle one is current policies. In other words, we have cut down from that. But the next one is pledged. This is what we said we were going to do. And then the bottom one is what we really need to keep it down to 1.5 degrees Celsius. We do know that we've had a lot of climate activists marching for things, but we didn't get very far with the powers that be. A lot of the countries sort of made minimal kind of admissions or made minimal commitments or had their sort of ability to change cut back by politics at home, like Biden, for example, and the United States. So there was a lot of that. There was a lot of kind of things of people promising yet not fulfilling their pledges and so on. So this is an ongoing problem, the sort of put it off till later mentality. And this is exhibited by a lot of nations. In fact, one of the problems is that every nation seems to consider things only from their perspective and kind of leaves the planet out. I think of nationalism as a major problem in this international problem that we have to deal with in climate change. If we have to come together as a planet. You know, all these science fiction movies where we come together as a planet when we have to fight off an alien. We got to do it now. We got to get our acts together and we've got to work. Here's some great quotes about nationalism. When you think about it, nationalism, the last refuge of scoundrels, Churchill. Nationalism is an infantile disease, the measles of mankind, Einstein. Nationalism, power hunger, tempered by self-deception, Orwell. My favorite, though, is from G.K. Chesterton. It says, my country, right or wrong, is like my mother, drunk or sober. Just saying, just let that sink in for a minute. So we know we need internationalism. Yet we have very parochial people, either in power or close to power. We know that Mitch McConnell was in power before the recent Senate change. And now we also know that he's threatening to be in power if he comes back after the election in this coming November. But yet he's still famous for quotes like this. If I'm still majority leader of the Senate after next year, none of these things are going to pass the Senate. They won't even be voted on. So think of me as the Grim Reaper. None of that stuff is going to pass. None of it. None of it. Now, this human crybaby, this man who has never gotten a vote outside the state of Kentucky, will be responsible for blocking a potential change in our climate policy as a nation and therefore as a world. I just let that sink in. Now, I don't feel partisan for either the Democrats, obviously not the Republicans, but I feel partisan for planet Earth. And I see knuckleheads like this, and I want to start swinging. The Republicans weren't always like this. Ladies and gentlemen, think back at the beginning of the 20th century, Teddy Roosevelt and the Square Deal. Teddy Roosevelt established national park after national park. He made establishing national parks part of the framework. He established the United States Forest Service. He was a regulator of commerce and business in the United States. He signed the Pure Food and Drug Act, and he signed the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. Roosevelt was for smart regulation, and Roosevelt was basically for the environment. He had his detractions, but Roosevelt was basically, especially compared to what we've seen, a very much environmentalist. He in fact met the famous John Muir at one of the most famous pieces of environmental history. In 1903, President Teddy Roosevelt, was whistle stopping around the United States, sort of making a grand tour. And as he whistle stopped through California, he got to near Yosemite and he was met by John Muir. And they went off with a small group into the Yosemite wilderness. And then Roosevelt and Muir and three other minders were out alone for 3 days. And Roosevelt and Muir hiked. Roosevelt and Muir talked about the park. They talked about bird calls. They talked about flora and fauna. And then Muir sold him on making Yosemite a national park. Roosevelt goes back to Washington. He makes Yosemite a national park. He proceeds to follow up and make other national parks. This was one of the great moments of environmental history in the United States. And can you imagine any other president since even doing something remotely like this? Can you imagine Donald Trump in the woods with, anyway. By the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt and the Democratic Party were working to put people back to work. And one of the ways they did was in the Civilian Conservation Corps. The Civilian Conservation Corps at the time was made up of young men between 18 and eventually 28. There was about 300,000 a year, and they were employed by the federal government to work on things like parklands, to build bridges, to build campgrounds, to build all sorts of things. And they worked as groups, and a part of their money was sent home. And this became a sort of a basis point for projections about a Green New Deal, being able to put a Civilian Conservation Corps, some young people who need jobs combined with other people to work helping the environment, a Rooseveltian idea. By the 1950s, though, the United States was booming. The United States didn't really need social programs. The United States economy grew more than 37% in the 1950s. And it was an extraordinary development. And it was suburbia, all kinds of things that were sort of polluting. When you think about it, this is Los Angeles in the late 50s, and this would go on for years. So the booming 1950s had environmental consequences, not only in Southern California with its bowl-like sort of weather systems, but also in places like Ohio, where the Cuyahoga River outside Cleveland caught on fire. And this was, I believe Randy Newman wrote the song afterwards by the early 70s. So I think this happened in the late 60s. But rivers catching fire in Cleveland, Los Angeles pollution, etc. We were spawning environmentalists who were calling on us to slow things down and to listen. The famed Aldo Leopold, who wrote a Sand County Almanac in 1948. He was an extraordinary, he said, humans are part of the environment, not its masters. Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring in 62, posited the notion that citizens have the right to be secure from poisons, the idea that it should be part of things. During the late 60s, the environmental movement picked up steam. This was part of the general anti-war thing. It was also environmental. In 1970, in April 1970, we had our first Earth Day. I was a senior in high school, and we actually marched to school and stuff. Of course, I was exhausted. 3 miles, you got to be kidding. At the same time, it was quite an event. Across the nation, approximately 100 million people did some sort of action on that day. And the EPA was created in 1970 by the Environmental Protection Act. The signer of that was a Republican. I posit this because I think at the time it was a relatively bipartisan thing to be willing to do something environmental. So Nixon signed, I'm not a fan of Nixon, but on this, I have to be honest. He signed the Environmental Protection Act of 1970. He signed the Clean Air Act of 1970. He signed the Clean Water Act of 1972. He was a Republican, but this was going on. It was kind of bipartisan. But then came the Arab-Israeli War of the fall of 1973 and 1974. And suddenly the Arabs did an oil embargo, at least the petro states did an oil embargo of both Western Europe and North America and Japan, and it was crippling. And it was trying to show their potential power, but they made it a reality. We went from having, 19-cent gas wars to suddenly they were having limits on the gas they were selling. This made people aware of standards of autos. And they started talking about miles per gallon and changing things. And what happened in the United States was they actually started pushing things by the early middle 70s. And as you can see the graph, we went from about 13 miles per gallon for cars and say 11.7 for trucks, into the high teens for trucks and the middle 20s for cars. This would be further pushed, these corporate automobile fuel efficiency standard, by the Obama administration. So we've managed to push this up. But then came three nuclear accidents, actually. The first was the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident in Pennsylvania in 1979. This was a near meltdown that didn't really happen, but it didn't really get too far. But then the Chernobyl nuclear meltdown in 1986 in Ukraine, what was the Soviet Union, that blew the top off a reactor, an extraordinary moment. And that was damaging, spread radioactive winds into Western and Northern Europe. And it was very poisonous. There still to this day is 1,000-mile square exclusion zone around this old reactor. And everything is like in a museum state at that point. Meanwhile, in 2011, Fukushima in northern Japan, a reactor was hit first by an earthquake, and then the generation system was knocked offline by the resultant tsunami. Defense in depth had not worked to prevent a reactor mishap. So people were realizing reactors screw up. And then came a reality that has only recently gotten more publicized. And this is the reality that Exxon actually knew it was pumping carbon into the atmosphere, and it knew the potential it had for disastrous effects. They sent out an ocean liner that had been changed over with all sorts of weather instrumentation and so forth in the late 70s, and it came back with a variety of readings. And they knew that the amount of parts per million were going to increase from, at the time, the mid 300s to about 560 parts per million, and that this would happen in the next century, within 90 years or so. And it has been moving in that direction. Exxon knew there was a variety of things. They had a man also who worked for them, who said all this, and this Roger Cohen, the director of theoretical and mathematical sciences, has made speeches which are part of the public record at this point. And so what happened is Exxon hid all this evidence. And so they knew that this was happening. They knew fossil fuel was actually fueling a potential climate apocalypse. And at the same time, we had run into the Arab oil embargo and then the 1979 Iranian Revolution. Jimmy Carter had put solar panels on the roof, and he had them on the roof of the White House. In 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected and overthrew him. His first act was to take off the solar panels from the White House roof. In the first week, that knucklehead took down solar panels. He then sort of moved in a direction of backing mining on federal lands and variously moving in a right-wing direction, a lot of pro-energy fossil fuel, in other words, fossil fuel policies, etc. And at this point, we can see a huge break from what had been a Republican-Democrat bipartisanship on environmental ideas, say through Nixon, to this point, Reagan actively working against environmental policies. And his administration was actually moving to the right. And so at the end of the 80s, in 1988, this is James Hansen of NASA, they had basically come to the reality that climate was changing. They had basically, I don't know if they had got hold of any of the Exxon research, but they had come to their own same conclusions. He testified in the summer of 1988, and this was a transformative event. And around the world, people were clamoring from some sort of a conference. And this happened in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, the first Earth Summit in 1992. And the United States at this time was kind of foot draggy. There was a lot of an attempt to acknowledge that we had to do something about it. But the man signing that particular treaty or whatever it is he's signing is, of course, George H.W. Bush, who had made his fistful of money actually in the petroleum industry before he entered public life. So the United States was foot dragging from the beginning on these summits. There was the Kyoto Protocol in the late 90s. This is in the early 2000s, how the Bush administration was treating the very idea of the Kyoto signatory here. Now, what that did, it called for the United States being one of many nations that would have to cut back. There was a balking at that, bipartisan balking in the Senate, and the so-called Byrd-Hagel resolution would be passed later, which said the United States should not be signatory to any Protocol 2 or other agreement regarding the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, 1992. So in other words, we're not going to have to do it. It was kind of like that. By the end of the first decade, Republicans had moved in a direction that was contrary to any climate change beliefs. They were also being funded heavily by the Koch brothers and other right-wing sort of figures. The party establishment was moving in a direction that was sort of libertarian and definitely in a direction of fossil fuel allegiance. Remember Drill Baby Drill as part of Republican conventions with Sarah Palin? So they've definitely off the charts on that one. So by the time he was in his second term, Barack Obama was doing climate things by executive fiat. Understandably, he was trying to circumvent what was then a Republican Congress, or at least a part Republican Congress. And he, by executive fiat, said that in 2012, 13 years later, we would move CAFE standards. This is our miles per gallon standards up to 54.5. He pushed the Clean Power Plan in 2015. He happily signed the Paris Climate Accords in 2015. I was very keen, and I wish some of those executive things had passed, because this is the kind of stuff we stood to gain. This is, if we had followed those things, we would have gotten this fleet-wide average of 54.5. We'd have saved 12 billion barrels of oil and eliminated 6 billion metric tons of CO2 pollution. Anybody home? Sounds like a good idea to me. But in 2016, in the fall, the Electoral College of the United States where 2.8 million popular votes don't, a margin of loss, don't indicate much. This man was elected. And he was very much against any of the notions of climate change. He said it was a hoax. And he said a concept of global warming was created by and for the Chinese in order to make manufacturing non-competitive. The United States, for the next 4 years, would follow what was called a policy of energy dominance. And this was the notion. So as we were beginning to work against an existential threat, we had a president actively working to make it worse. Then we had 2015, Obama had signed this, Trump pulled out of the Paris Accords, but when Biden came back in a year ago, he was able to legally rejoin the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement, of course, is much stronger when all the nations of the world. Remember, the League of Nations, the United States refused to join. 20 years later, you've got Nazis marching over Eastern Europe. I mean, combining together makes sense. Trying to get along is a good notion. So when Biden came in a year ago, he had certain defined ideas, a lot of which I was kind of impressed by, because comparatively speaking, it was not enough. But he had been pushed slightly left by Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and Washington Governor Jay Inslee. When he was running, he had been pushed slightly left, and he was offering things in terms of the Build Back Better build and somewhat in his infrastructure that are moving us in a greener direction. And the idea being that we commit as a government to move toward a clean economy in the next years. And these notions are sort of background to what he was running along. And a lot of the ideas, of course, had come from the Green New Deal. This is AOC right there, and Andrea Ocasio-Cortez, and that's Senator Ed Markey to her left. And they proposed a lot with the Green New Deal, and the whole thing is a series of potential possibilities that are both green and socially democratic. USA to meet 100% alternative energy by 2035. USA to build smart grids across the country, to refurbish and rebuild existing buildings to make them more energy efficient. Basically, it's a slew of green jobs, something like the Civilian Conservation Corps, but a lot more, a lot jobbed out to various places. All this business about refurbishing, that's a lot of employment. But it also pushes the country in a direction that moves us along, that's been necessary for a long time. So I find this kind of provocative. And of course, that picture on the left, that's kind of a good comic book cover. Just saying, I love comic books. Now here, we also have what's blocking us in the Democratic Party. This is, I'm just pointing this out because we're dealing with people like Mitch McConnell. This man, Senator Joe Manchin, is ostensibly a US Senator from West Virginia. Now, he is also head of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. He receives the most donations from the fossil fuel industries of anyone serving among the 535 members of Congress. He has a Maserati, and he also has a yacht that's called Almost Heaven on the Potomac River. He's benefited hugely from the coal industry over time. And he only represents one state. West Virginia has 1.8 million people compared to the 330 million in the US. These days, it only has less than 13,000 coal miners left. In the 1980s, beginning of the 80s, when Reagan was president, there were 60,000. By the end of his time, it had gone to 30,000, and now it's less than 13,000. So it's a bit of a mythology that the West Virginia is a coal mining state. It's also kind of a mythology that therefore the coal miners are for him. The United Mine Workers have also said they want him to vote for the Build Back Better bill. So he doesn't have the support of the union or a coal union type business. There are a lot of people accepting they're willing to move forward. He's not. So as we get toward the end, let's summarize what we've been through in a lot of ways. We first of all went through 10 to 12,000 years an agricultural revolution, where we centralized food production, led to the emergence of cities, and stimulated more rapid population growth. Some would say maybe it was a bad deal. Then came the Industrial Revolution. Once again, this leads to a lot of soot and smoke. The invention and use of power-driven machines dramatically increased productivity. They also made for a lot of movies of sort of grudging immigrant sort of steel workers. And then we had the digital revolution, spread of new information and communications technologies, leading into outsourced production, widespread data consumption, and lots of Silicon Valley startups. That's the digital evolution is domineering. What we need now is a sustainability revolution. We need to reorganize the economy around new forms of zero emissions, healthy, equitable, sustainable ideas. That's the kind of stuff that has to move us forward. From now on, start thinking sustainability revolution. And you have to be as active and beyond what you're capable of. You have to help out. This is all the, okay, recycle, eat organic, compost, no food waste, travel less, all those things are good. But voting is key. And also convincing other people they have to vote about the climate. They have to vote about the environment. This is something that's as key as anything else. Remember, if you think the climate, the economy is more important than the climate, think about that. You have to vote. The climate is at least as important as the economy. You can also join environmental groups. These are all different ones. I've been involved, Sierra Club, National Resources Defense Council, Environmental Defense Fund, Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, Nature Conservancy, blah, blah, blah. Add a green to the title. There's a lot of great groups doing a lot of good work out there, and everybody can use help, including the Mendocino Trail Stewards who are working right here to make a difference. There are numerous groups in Mendocino County who are working to make a difference. I mentioned the Trail Stewards because I think they're brilliant. So when we get toward the end, let's remember things that people have said, like George Carlin. The planet is fine. Compared to the people, the planet is doing great. Been here 4.5 billion years. We've been here, what, maybe 200,000? The planet's been through a lot worse than us. Been through earthquakes, volcanoes, plate tectonics, continental drifts, solar flares, sunspots. The planet isn't going anywhere. We are, potentially. We don't have to. We don't have to because of things like this. This is a great Chinese proverb proffered from my friend Evan Mills. And it's, when the winds of change blow, some build walls, others build windmills. Well, I say let's build some windmills. Let's make both a practical and a spiritual choice here. Let's move things in another direction by proaction. So we can try to make a difference with the planet. I will gladly entertain any questions, comments, etc. right at this point. But ladies and gentlemen, that's been the presentation for this evening. I think I made it inside of 70 minutes. I hope I wasn't too blabby. So I am going to press escape. And I can see that some people, I'm going to stop the share. And I see that there's a chat. Was there a Q&A too? Oh yeah, there's a Q&A. Let me take the Q&A first over here. Garth Sulfield says, how do we best address the CPUC's proposed taxes on solar home utility company generation? I don't have an answer for that. Perhaps someone else can. And Garth also says, energy should have been deleted from the last question. Okay. HRC equals fracking queen. So if anybody has any comments for Garth, that's good. So I will move on. So there's a couple over in the chat, I think. Here, I'm coming over to the chat. Good. Cynthia Gare says, thank you for including mention of vegetarian diets, or BRP class host. Vegetarian diets playing a critical role, often ignored. Thank you. Good, wonderful. Thanks. I really appreciate you coming. It's fun for me to do. I really enjoy doing it. I probably enjoy doing it in an outsized and somewhat ridiculous way. I'm one of those guys that I really like it. I wish I could get paid to be an environmental, presenter. And, I'm basically a popularizer, and I realize that there's real scientists who have helped me, though. And I think you know who you are, Evan Jamgoshen. Many of you have helped me over time. Wei Tai Kwok, if you're out there, you've been brill. So anyway, I appreciate it. Does anybody else have anything? Let's see, I'll read a couple more of them. Vegetarian diet produces pain and suffering of beings who share our earthly home. Thank you, Doug. Okay, here's one. Helen to host. Call the governor to demand that he does not accept CPUC trending. Mark Williams, old buddy. When you mentioned a 3 to 5 year time frame between a theoretical, there you go. Sorry, Williams. 3 to 5 year theoretical cessation of carbon pollution and stop to temperature rise. Michael Mann has come out with that in the last years. He, of course, is a solid climate scientist. I've read a couple of his books. He did a book with the Washington Post political cartoonist a couple of years, Tom Tolles. He was terrific. And he posited this notion. It kind of surprised my friend Evan. I think it's a little bit rosy. It might be a little bit rosy in terms of projection. And I think there are ways. We saw during the first 8 months or so of COVID, how much pollution went down, like in the LA basin. So some of it might be a little bit of that. So in other words, I'm not sure how pure it is, or how much it really is true, how much it resonates. Regarding, I've been presenting to high schoolers to answer your question. Isn't there enough? I put a couple questions in the Q&A. It's Alex Saban. Okay, here says, so Mark said, isn't there enough CO2 in the atmosphere to keep things warming for decades? Yes, unfortunately. You're bringing up a very good point. There is enough. Also, CO2 typically has a life of something like 100 years or around that. So each time we spew a molecule of CO2, we're effectively giving us our great grandmother's blanket. And this is what's going on. And so methane doesn't last as long, but methane is more of a problem. So there is plenty of CO2, and it will continue warming for a while. I just finished a novel over here, The Ministry for the Future, which is, it's kind of provocative. Basically, he talks about doing geoengineering solutions. I don't agree with that, but it's interesting that he thinks the climate crisis might push us to that point. And I thought that was a fascinating notion. But there is plenty of CO2 out there. And I think it's projected that we will continue to see a temperature rise for a while. We need to do everything we can to slow it. Also, sort of coming online is the increasing likelihood that permafrost unfreezing will also contribute to the climate blanket. So anyway, regarding where is Al Gore, Al Gore he was presented for the October training I was at for 2 weeks. He was busy. The guy works his butt off. When he gives a speech, he actually really, he's got all the slides going on. He's out there, his arms are waving and everything. You know, the guy hustles. I think he's 73 now, but so to speak, he can get around on a fastball. I'm not kidding. I know Williams will appreciate that. I was impressed. He's got kind of silvery hair now. But he's a hustler. He gets 100%. I've been volunteering. I've been mentoring, which means that you basically help organize students in the last 3 of the virtual performances, and they're worthwhile. Oh, I also want to share something with you. I was hoping to present. The dinosaur thing at the end of the. Let me try to find it here for you. The UN put out a really good I'm trying to find the sharing here. The UN put out a really good, God, I can't find it right now. I'm sorry. I can send it to as many people as possible. Let me try to find it and send it to you. But the UN put out a video that's about a dinosaur coming to present to the UN, to UN General Assembly. And it turns out to be like a velociraptor. And he walks into the UN General Assembly and he makes a short speech where he said, "What are you guys doing? What are you doing helping out climate change? I'm telling you, it's the equivalent of us giving a subsidy to a comet." And he's a little bit like, "Anybody home?" And it ends up being a very effective 2-minute piece. So I will try to post it. And it's only 2 minutes and it's definitely work. So I see that somebody else is saying the mirror reflection. He did a TED talk recently. How do we get a recording? I plan to put it up on YouTube in the next couple of days. It takes me most of an evening or whatever. Yeah, here Bob Evans is pointing out that the CO2 is a stable molecule. It doesn't go away unless it is sequestered by plants or reacts with another chemical. Methane will eventually oxidize. Thanks for the clear up there, Bob. Here's the dino video. Great. Cynthia Garrett has put it up. This dino video is totally worth it. I highly recommend you go to chat and you copy the dino video over there that Cynthia has put up. Let me see if there's been any more questions. Where is Al Gore? Okay, we were just telling, we do need people to tell him to vote. He's always, just so you know, the old guy is always telling people to vote. He wants everybody to vote. He does one great thing when he was asked about, shouldn't you run for office again? The perpetual question. He said, I got to tell you, I'm a recovering politician. I don't want to be part of the political scene anymore. And he talks about that. And I thought it was pretty interesting. And I also thought it was somewhat revealing to hear him. And he's totally dedicated to making a difference for the planet at this point. I can't see him representing a Congress district in Tennessee or something. So anywho, so it looks like we kind of dealt with a lot of the questions. Does anybody have any general thing to share or anything? I must admit I had a good time, and so I hope you did too. I started recording, I think, after I first did the getting everybody's attention, so I think I stopped. So it's probably about 2 minutes in, so I definitely cocked up the first part. That's not going to be news to anybody who knows me. So anyway, I'm ready to head out. So I wish you all well, unless anybody has any final things here. I had a great time. I'm so glad you came, and I'll put it up, and please spread the news. Anybody's welcome to use it, please. And you got to dispute it. That's your business. So anyway, I wish you all well. Thank you very much for being here. I'm going to turn off the recording.